Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers, presented by FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. This is often the most painful portion of my week, Ant. I just need to throw that out so you understand
just get it
the
over
gravity
James.
of the situation that you keep ignoring. You would think that after 3 years, you would have gone and found a class somewhere to figure out how to be more interesting. But anyway. What's new and exciting in your world this week, Anthony, you boring human being?
There are a few topics we tend not to discuss on Words and Numbers, largely because we don't know anything about them. When we're as likely to deliver the same quality information as a random walk through Twitter, we prefer to remain silent. One of those topics is the environment, which tells you I'm about to break our rule. The EPA reports that carbon dioxide, CO2, comprises 80% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And there are important footnotes that go beyond our expertise, such as differences in how long various gases persist in the atmosphere and differences in the potency of the various greenhouse gases. But footnotes aside, it's clear that CO2 is at least a major greenhouse gas. I ran across data on CO2 emissions over time and found some surprising news that I hesitate to say is good, but certainly points in a good direction. The data come from ourworldindata.org, a treasure trove of interesting information from around the world. World CO2 emissions continue to rise, but the rise is steadily slowing, from 5.4% annual growth in the 1950s to 1.5% growth in the 2010s. Of course, CO2 emissions are still growing, but that they are growing so much more slowly should be cause for hope. The story gets more interesting when we look at the 5 largest CO2 emitting countries. That's the US, China, India, Russia, and Japan. In the United States, CO2 emissions actually peaked in 2005 and have been declining since. As of last year, the U.S. was emitting the same CO2 levels emitted back in 1993, despite having an economy that's almost twice the size. Similarly, Japan's CO2 emissions have been falling precipitously since 2012 and are now at the same level they were in 1990. Russia's CO2 levels aren't falling, but they've held pretty stable since the mid-2000s. The culprits here, of course, are China and India. But even there, the news isn't all bad. China's emissions continue to grow, but at a much slower pace, less than 3% per year in the 2010s versus more than 9% per year in the 2000s. India's continues to grow more than 5% per year. That's faster than the global average, but that growth has been falling from 7% back in the 1980s. The important thing here is that as technology increases, what's happening is there's, of course, an increase in CO2 emissions as we move from agrarian societies into industrial societies, but then there's a decline as we move from industrial societies into technological societies. And what we're seeing worldwide is that as the more developed nations are progressing, their CO2 emissions are declining. India and China are rising, but rising more slowly. But India and China are perhaps developmentally, I'd say, 2 decades behind the more developed countries? What that means is, over the course of the next couple decades, we should see them peaking and then declining.
Instead of offering my own commentary on this, I'm just going to sit back because you can deal with all the hate mail and I won't. I'm sure you're going to get some. Now for something completely different. If you hang around young people, and I think you're near young people, but you don't hang around with them, I actually get crawling a little bit into their lives to figure out the pop culture of newer generations and things like this. But we've got a very funny thing that's happening right now, and it's from a very brief post on Roger Friedman's Showbiz 411. I don't even know what to think about this, but the top 2 albums on iTunes right now are held by Queen and Joni Mitchell.
Really? Now, I noticed this. I don't know if I mentioned it on a previous episode, but at least mentioned to you privately. My children, who are in their late teens, early 20s, are listening to music that you and I listened to when we were teenagers.
Yeah, look, I took my 2 daughters, 20 and 18 at the time, out to see Toto
Right.
Yeah, if you had told me when I was 15 that one day I would take my daughters to see Toto, A, I would have said, Toto's still around? And B, I would have said something like, yeah, probably not, drawing from my own experiences with my own family. But it's strange how the younger generation is now grasping for something that you and I took more or less for granted when we were young, right? There wasn't this panoply of choice where you didn't just get to decide what you were going to listen to. We had 3 channels on TV and we had 3 stations on the radio.
Yeah.
That's what you got.
And I hate to sound like an old person, but I think music really was better back then.
It was. And how do you know? Young people now are drifting back to it.
Right.
And these 2 records, Queen and Joni Mitchell, 1981 and 1971. Not only is it a long time ago, that's my freshman year in high school.
Yeah, well, 71, I was in first grade.
In 71, I was 4.
Yeah.
So something's going on here. And I noticed it a while back when my daughters would, like when they were little, when they were really little, they would come in and they would say, can I get the new Taylor Swift album? And I'd say, sure. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this is going to suck for decades. And before you know it, they were asking me for things like The Cure.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, I can live with this. This is not bad.
My son stopped in my office the other day and said, hey, have you heard of The Police?
Rings a distant bell, Junior. Rings a distant bell. Look, it's just an interesting thing, right? When we were young, oldies were all the rage, right? We were probably looking at 1955 to 1962 or something.
Sure.
And we listened to that. We thought, all right, the Stones and Zeppelin were great, but let's maybe get us back to the modern age. The kids now think that classic rock is cool. I'm kind of happy about that. I like the fact that they want to listen to something with a little more substance than the nonsense that populates the top 40.
Next thing you know, my wardrobe will be popular again.
No, bell bottoms are never coming back for a third time yet. You're just going to have to live with that. God, what a jackass. Anyway, that's the perfect segue, I guess, for the foolishness of the week. Foolishness of the week, you. You and your bell bottoms and your jacket and your sweater all simultaneous. But I want to get us to Washington, D.C. for the foolishness of the week this week. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a baseball team in Washington, D.C. called the Nationals. Funny because when they ordered their first set of shirts for the team to wear, they left the I out of it. It was just
You're kidding.
No.
How many I's did that have to pass over? And all of them miss it.
That's right. And you and I often talk about trying to be careful when you write, maybe proofread one last time. Well, here you go. But anyway, you go look that up on the Google and you will find all kinds of pictures of the Nationals jerseys. The Nationals this past week were offering a fireworks show in celebration of the 4th of July. And what could be more appropriate than a fireworks show at a baseball game on the 4th of July?
Right.
I mean, you're hitting 3 of the big things all with one shot. Except the whole ordeal was a lot more American than you might think, because a bunch of whiny people who live around the park decided that they didn't want to hear the fireworks on the 4th of July. And the Nationals, being an organization with no spine whatsoever, canceled them. So in D.C., at a baseball game, the baseball team canceled the 4th of July celebration because neighbors whined about it. It went from being the perfect illustration of America
to the perfect
being
illustration.
The absolutely perfect illustration of America.
Right.
Everybody involved here should be ashamed of themselves. The only correct answer was, come on, Nancy, it's the 4th of July. Suck it up just this once and leave us alone.
Fireworks would have been going off all over the city. I don't know what anybody gained by this, except to make a bunch of baseball fans angry.
They gained that moral high ground that the Karens always grab. It's really obnoxious. There it is. It's the perfect foolishness of the week, I think. I should say, Ant, there were 3 other stories that were neck and neck with this one. And we're going to talk about all 3 of those on the Patreon bonus material. So give the people one more reason to throw us a couple of shekels a month and join over there.
For people who are looking to watch baseball and fireworks at the same time, I encourage you to come to Pittsburgh. We make our own fireworks here, and Pittsburghers love them and set them off for anything. St. Patrick's Day, right. Whatever, Boxing Day, any excuse to set off fireworks.
I've never been to a place that loves fireworks more than Pittsburgh.
Yeah. It's a lot like Parks and Rec and Little Sebastian.
Little Sebastian, yeah. On that happy note, why don't you introduce the guests, Ant, which don't include me at all?
This week is part 2 of our discussions of economics and government with Clark Neily, Rob McDonald, and Howard Baetjer. We interrupted this 2-part series for an interview with Rob McDonald for July 4th. That was last week. You can find the first of this 2-part episode back at episode number 228.
I'm Rob McDonald. I teach history at West Point.
I'm Howard Baetjer. I teach economics at Towson University.
I'm Clark Neily, and I'm Senior Vice President for Legal Studies at the Cato Institute.
And hopefully you'll recognize their voices from other podcast episodes. All 3 of these gentlemen had been on Words and Numbers. So here we are sitting. We got together for a weekend just as old friends to sit and talk about things. So we thought we'd turn on the microphone and share some of the really good conversation that's been going on. I want to go back to your claim, Howie, that you're not concerned with production of goods and services. Because I am. And here's why. I suspect that the political pressure will be such that you talk about this crisis dividing us in some way. I worry that the political pressure will be such as to cause the politicians, as they're doing now, to focus their attention on the rich, to hold them up and say the reason that we're in such dire straits is because the rich aren't paying their fair share or what have you. And so the call then is not to do what we should be doing, which is cutting back on Social Security, for example. It's to raise taxes on the rich, which you can do the math. You could take 100% of the rich's wealth, not their income, their wealth. Take 100% of it, and it would pay off the deficit for this year, but that's pretty much it. Maybe half of next year's deficit. And that's it. And then there's no more rich people, right? There's no more 1%. So clearly, that's not where the money lies. Where the money lies is with the middle class. Now, the politicians know this, but they're not going to get any points from voters by saying it. So what they will do is hold up the rich as the scapegoats. And that's what's going to hit your production of goods and services. Because all of a sudden, entrepreneurs coast to coast are going to say, why am I busting my butt and taking my risk with employing people and having businesses when I'm going to be next?
Yeah, that's plausible.
I've been wondering whether a canary in the mine shaft here is when the government makes it virtually impossible to leave the country with any of your wealth.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's something that highly productive people will have to start. Just like highly productive people are leaving New Jersey and California and New York, right? If there comes a point where highly productive people want to leave the United States, the difference is the United States has the ability to say, well, you can leave, but you can't take any of your money with you.
Yeah, and this is interesting. I think there's a race going on. It's a race between how long the federal government can keep up this Ponzi scheme and the development of cryptocurrency, because that's how you get your wealth out. Now, Jeff Bezos isn't going to be able to, but regular people can. You convert to a cryptocurrency, and there's no way the government can stop that.
Before we get off on that, let me amplify something Ant said a moment ago. The other thing that could mean that a financial crisis, sort of strictly understood as financial, could really affect the ability to produce goods and services is inflation. If the response to all this debt is, well, we're just going to have to print money and pay it off with new money, then you get bad inflation. And bad inflation is very, very destructive to the operation of a market economy, because not all prices are affected in the same way. And so the meaningfulness of relative prices gets screwed up. People put a lot more effort into finding ways to avoid the problems of the inflation instead of finding ways to build a better mousetrap and create.
And you can't plan. You can't plan for the future.
Yeah,
because
it's much harder.
And so you get what we saw in the COVID lockdown. So much of the decline in GDP was people just sitting back and saying, I can't plan for the future, so I'm just going to sit on my money and see what happens.
You hear all these ads on podcasts and radio and television for gold.
Right.
And I've thought, okay, well, we built a little bit of a nest egg, don't want to lose it, don't want to see it eroded to inflation. Maybe we should consider putting money into gold. Of course, gold has its risks as well, but correct me if I'm wrong, economist, but when you own gold, it's just sitting there in the gold. But when you invest in the stock market, that money is going to be used by people to build factories.
To create goods and services.
Yeah. Hey, Ann, I want to push back on your premise that cryptocurrency might solve the problem of wealthy people who want to leave a country. So can you just explain what you think this enables them to do, and then I'm going to see if I can
Yeah, so your claim, as I heard it, was that the government is going to make it difficult for you to take your wealth outside the country.
Which they already do to some extent, right? Because we're one
Right.
of the only countries in the world that does double taxation of expats and so forth. But
Right.
but let's say it gets a lot worse. Like, you can't take anything.
Right. So, for example, I sell my house, I sell my whatever stocks are in my retirement fund, I buy cryptocurrency. Now I leave the country. The government can't hold that crypto within the U.S. because it's intangible. So I can go to some foreign country and then sell the crypto for the local currency, and now I can buy a house and whatever it is.
What if the government can make a very persuasive case that you ought to remit that money, as the law requires you to do?
How's it going to force me to do that?
What if a white van showed up in front of your house and suddenly you found yourself wearing an orange jumpsuit on a
Sure.
C-130 back to the States? You think our government's not capable of that?
Well, you're going to have to see how far you push this, because there are ways that I can purchase the crypto without the government knowing it, or without them being able to trace it to me.
Right. So as far as the government knows, you're a pauper and you just decided to leave the country.
Right.
Right. Okay, that I agree with.
The traceability really matters here.
Yes. It's everything.
Because if it's traceable, Clark could get the guy, the law enforcement, the tyranny enforcement officer to come and put you into yellow jumpsuit.
Right.
But if they can't trace the crypto, then you...
Right, and you notice what happens here is that the government cannot trace the crypto. What they're doing currently is grabbing hold of the exchanges. So if you exchange through, the big one is Coinbase. You exchange through Coinbase, the government will require Coinbase to turn over records of who's conducting transactions. But the fact is, it's convenient to buy crypto through Coinbase. I don't have to.
Yeah.
I can buy it separate from the exchange.
The other thing here is, as I understand it, it's very difficult. It's a real challenge. It can be done if you get Coinbase's records with a whole lot of effort. Crypto ownership can be traced within certain limits. But it's not easy. It's not something that's automatically easy to do.
That's a surprise to me. I mean, define easy, right? But I mean, now you've got a government that's very interested not only in making sure they get your wealth, but also making an example of you so others don't do what you've tried to do. Now, I agree with Ant. If we get to a point where the transfer of, what do you want to call it, currency? I don't know.
Cryptocurrency?
Right.
Yeah,
well,
right.
the transfer of wealth, whatever,
wealth, right.
is untraceable to the invisible and untraceable. Then, I think then we've got a situation where it suddenly becomes a lot more rational for people who are subject to the kinds of both high and disproportionate taxes that we face here in the U.S.
And that, to me, by the way, that is the main overriding appeal of cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
that the government can't.
And this sounds so nefarious, what we're describing as something wrong, but it's what Americans do every day. People are leaving in droves, California and Connecticut, for precisely this reason. The taxes have become onerous. So what do? They move to Florida, they move to Utah, wherever it is they move. And you don't think twice about it. In fact, you say, yeah, that's reasonable. Now, what we're talking about is the same exact thing. It's just a different border that you're crossing.
Yeah.
Well, and Texas apparently and Florida make pretty appealing pitches for high wealth people, because how do we know? Because they're headed there, and so are businesses. But it becomes a very interesting question, right? Whether that can be replicated internationally. Like, what country would you go to right now if you're a high wealth individual? And what you hope is that you'll stay one step ahead of, I suppose if your wealth is literally untraceable and you can go to pretty much anywhere, they can't dispossess you, right? So what's your real risk of going to some other country? Well, you're not living in the United States, so you don't have the benefit of things that are uniquely, that we have uniquely in the States. You're living in, by definition, a country that is subject to being invaded, right? How do we know? Because there is no country that's as powerful as the United States, at least currently. And your choices of other superpowers are pretty unattractive right now.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about a place like Costa Rica where you hope you're going to end up being sort of a mammal in the age of the dinosaurs. You're just going to try and stay out of the way if U.S. gets expansionist. But you're certainly not going to China, right? But this is an interesting question. Where might a high wealth individual who's finally sick of essentially being expropriated in the U.S. go if they had the ability to take that wealth, because crypto is untraceable, becomes untraceable, It's an interesting question where they might go.
Well, yeah, and I want to make a distinction because I would say, you say high wealth individuals. The rich, the really rich, already do this, right? And they've got St. Nevis and Kitts and whatever these island nations are, right, that they go to. But I'm picturing this.
You're talking about upper middle class.
I'm talking about upper middle class. Yeah.
Maybe I've missed something. Could what Ant seems to be describing could be done with him staying right here. He just converts his tangible, seizable assets to crypto.
He suddenly looks middle class even though he's rich.
Right, yeah.
And makes up with them in the IRS. If somebody says, where did all this stuff go? He says, I made some terrible investments in cryptocurrency and lost it all.
I mean, your physical presence gives them an edge, right? I mean, so for one thing, you can't live in this house. Right,
yeah. Yeah, you're going to have to downsize.
You'll have to downsize because otherwise, I mean, if you've got a big physical footprint, they just come and tax the footprint.
Yeah.
So there are certain things, or, I mean, you could spin this out almost endlessly, but they start taxing the things that people like to do. You want to go skiing in Vail? Well, that's a 90% tax or whatever. So, and maybe part of it depends on how much of your utility can be delivered to you anonymously.
Yeah, I don't like where I see this conversation going because I think the solution is that the government outlaws crypto.
Oh, absolutely.
The government can outlaw it, but as I understand Bitcoin, they're powerless to enforce that as long as people have computers and there's an internet.
Let me push back on that too. Okay.
But they could maybe go after the farms, the mining machines.
They could. I think that's less of the issue because even if you wiped out all the mine, I don't know. We're now beyond my knowledge.
Cryptocurrency is just math.
What's that?
It's just mathematics. How can they outlaw the mathematics?
I don't think they can, but they can cheat a lot of other ways. They could maybe get one of your family members and say, does your father, does he do crypto? Right? And put the boots to one of your family members. Well, if you don't want to go to federal prison for the rest of your life, you got to give up your dad. That kind of thing.
Well, there's a precedent for this, right? Because the federal government, when we went off the gold standard, was it at that point that they outlawed gold?
Yeah.
There was some point in our recent history.
You had to turn it in.
Yeah.
There were steps. Yeah, the FDR. Any monetary gold had to be turned in. You could keep your wedding rings and so on, but it became illegal to own monetary gold or bullion.
So this sounds really dystopian to me. And I'd like to be the optimist and say,
good.
All right, we're not all going to convert to crypto and move to Costa Rica and flee our country. Instead, we're going to turn our country around. So here's the hard question. How does that happen?
I had an image. I'm not going to answer your question because I hope somebody can, but I had an image of getting stuck in a tar pit. And that's an analogy to what we've been doing financially. When was the last time we ran a surplus? It was under Clinton, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. And even that was sort of
depending on
a
how fudgy surplus.
Right, books,
yeah. So every year that you run a deficit is, in a sense, it's as if you're immersing one of your legs a little bit deeper into the tar pit, right? And if all you've got is you're a saber-toothed tiger with one paw in the tar pit, you could probably pull it out. But now you've got two paws in it, and you're still probably powerful. But at a certain point, and you don't know when that point is, you're far enough into the tar pit that you can't back out of it. You're stuck. And I get the feeling that unless something comes along to save us, I don't know, fusion or some massive increase in prosperity that we don't see, which is plausible. I do feel like we are basically edging into a kind of a financial tar pit. And we don't know when you get stuck to the point you cannot turn it around, right? So we may posit that we can still turn it around, but I think it's increasingly open to question whether we can turn it around under current conditions.
Maybe an answer to Rob's question is that if we get deep enough into the tar pit, we'll come to our senses and cut spending.
In time? The question is, will we do it in time?
In time for what? Think of what Anthony was saying earlier. As I understand it, if you do the kinds of cuts to government spending or just limitations on increases in government spending that we've been talking about, you can turn this around in 10, 15 years and so on. The disaster scenarios all involve this continuing to spend more and more. And when things get bad, we have a pandemic or we have a financial crisis or something, what we do, the damn politicians say, we need a government program, we need to spend more money, we need to stimulate the economy. And so the problems that they've caused by the last couple of decades spending lead to increased spending today.
What about the elephant in the room we haven't talked about yet really explicitly is hyperinflation, right? I mean...
Yeah, and we haven't talked about the connection between that and interest rates, which will really screw over the deficit problem.
Yeah. So there's a question to ask. Is anybody in this group prepared to say that hyperinflation is off the table as a possible scenario?
Yeah, I think it's off the table. Hyperinflation isn't well defined, but typically when economists use it, they mean extremely high, like in the thousands plus,
that's
millions
what I
of
had
a
in
percent.
mind. Right.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see that. My back of the envelope calculation was, even if we were to fully monetize deficits moving forward, you're talking 10%, maybe 20% sustained inflation, which is remarkable for the United States, but it's not hyperinflation.
But 20% is very damaging to economic performance. But the tie-in that I hope I understand well enough to articulate clearly is that if inflation does go to 20%, when the government wants to roll over all this debt, they go out to the bond market and say, oh, these 5-year bonds have come due. We need to borrow some more money to pay them off. The potential lenders say, okay, I want a positive return. So with inflation running at 20%, I want to get at least 2% real return. So here, I'll lend you money if you'll pay me 22% interest on it. And our debt is so big now that the compounding that would result in with paying this very high interest rates to roll over what we've already got, somebody's smart enough to do the arithmetic, but you get to the point where it simply can't be done. Then you have some kind of default.
We're going to have to print bigger checks. They're going to have to be a lot wider than they are now to
So you get a lot of zeros.
Contain all the zeros that people are going
Well, see, but that's an interesting thing, because I've hypothesized in the past that you could only do this once, is you come out with a new dollar. And the point of coming out with the new dollar is to hide the fact that you have massively inflated your currency. And what interested me is a couple of politicians have been talking about a federal cryptocurrency, that the government would sponsor one. And I'm thinking, that solves a couple of problems. One, it gets the government into the cryptocurrency space, which is going to evolve anyway. But two, it gives them the opportunity to come out with the new dollar. It's the crypto dollar.
Why is that a help for inflation?
Oh, no. Excuse me. It's a help for the government. For their aims. Yeah.
I'm so glad we got on the subject, because I was actually laying awake in bed, a month ago thinking about this. Imagine that we have, strong encryption that the government can't penetrate, right? And you and I exchange some information over the internet, and you and I do. And if what we're exchanging is I'm giving you currency, payment, and you're sending me, let's say, a movie, right, like Netflix does, that's a taxable transaction. The government wants to take a piece of that, right? If all we're doing is just sending each other a bunch of ones and zeros that don't mean anything, that's not a taxable event. And what the government has to be worrying about right now is its inability to know whether we exchanged a bunch of ones and zeros that had value to you and I, or there was literally a bunch of gibberish.
Right.
And if we're smart, what we do is you and I, if we are interested in having an economic relationship, we make sure that our computers spend a lot of time during the day just exchanging ones and zeros.
Numbers. Right.
So there's this cloud of ones and zeros going back and forth. The government's looking at it going, should we tax any of it? I don't know. Right. And the more that we're able to live our lives online, right, the more of our needs that are able to be fulfilled essentially by a stream of ones and zeros that we can then cloak with encryption.
I think that's right.
Makes the tax collector's job really hard, right? Because they don't know what's going back and forth between us. They can't identify taxable events.
Yeah.
Right? They can tax some things, like the fact that you live in a big house with a swimming pool, right? But if that's only a small part of my overall wealth, and it's only a small part of what I do, and when it comes to transacting with people.
Let me challenge this. That's good. Among the ones and zeros that I really put high value on is this streaming video of cool stuff. We're streaming Ken Burns' The Vietnam War. We'll watch the next episode tomorrow night, Susie and I. Isn't the government going to bully Netflix or Amazon or whoever it is that or PBS that's sending this stuff to us? So the big companies that have a reputation and a good business model and so on, can they hide what are the valuable ones and zeros in a cloud of meaningless gibberish ones and zeros, or is the government really going to be able to tax them?
They can once they move to the Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, and what you might end up with is a scenario where the government says, okay, I don't know which of these ones and zeros are valuable, therefore I'm going to tax the communication itself.
Yeah.
Every one or zero passes between you gets taxed.
Yep.
I don't care what it is.
Yep. It's interesting if you think about far enough into the future, maybe like after the invention of fusion, or the discovery of marketable fusion, whatever the right way to put it is, it's it's kind of an interesting thing to think about what will we value then, right? When all of your physical needs that you could possibly imagine are taken, there's no more scarcity. There's no more... Okay.
Economists speaking up. I've heard that just never happen, not by the nature of human beings.
Okay, so let's engage
and
on that.
People
Why
have
not?
said that for a long time.
Yeah.
There was one wonderful comment by I forget who it was, but somebody...
By the way, I wasn't done with the thought. There will be
okay.
things that are still valuable,
Yeah.
I think, but things will change. In other words, so if you could only eat so many meals, right, and they all have a marginal cost of what would be to us a few pennies, then your desire for gratification will presumably be elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
And I think it'll probably be, for want of a better word, novelty, to be entertained,
Yeah.
to be diverted.
How's that different from where we are right now in the United States? We pay tiny portion of our incomes, most of us, for food, shelter, and so on. So we don't need human beings swinging scythes and working on the farm.
Right.
What is it? 2.5% of the American population is involved in growing food and fiber. Mm-hmm. Well, years ago, people said, how, as these tools, these tractors and so on are developed, what are people going to do? They couldn't even imagine streaming video and podcasts and make these cool microphone I'm looking at and so on. I think it'll just be the same thing into the future as more and more needs can be taken care of by automation, computerization, and so on. People will turn around and say, well, great, now what would we like to have?
Well, let me give you an example. Right now, one of the things I like the most, enjoy the most, and get the most pleasure out of is to physically travel to another country, right?
Yeah.
But imagine that computer simulation gets so high quality that you can receive a more pleasurable experience in your own home through a computer simulation than getting on a plane and going to whatever country you fantasize about going to, right? So now what we're talking about is an environment in which virtually all of your consumption is information, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're still ingesting physical food, but it's kind of, down market, right? And so if 90 or 95 or 99% of your life is essentially the ingestion of information, so to speak, that is much different than where we are right now. That puts the government in a much different position, I would say, right?
I thought you were getting at that there wouldn't be jobs any longer, and their needs were satisfied, so there wasn't any work for people.
Well, I think there will be jobs, but I think the jobs will basically be figuring out how to entertain each other.
Right, yeah.
That was what I meant by saying, how's that different from now? Because you think of the massive increase in, our consumption of video, the NFL, which
not just
love.
consumption, but production.
Yeah.
How many people, I don't mean big productions, how many people are producing videos for YouTube or TikTok or whatever it is?
But the other thing is, human beings are something where these creative, imaginative, adaptable beings, and it might be we go far enough down this road, human beings are going to say, all right, we've gotten really used to all this information, this video stuff. What else would be cool? And, it might be, I've long wanted to play in the 1/6 gravity of the moon. I don't think I'm ever going to get there, but man, would it be cool if I would love to see the space industry develop to the point where you could go to the moon and you could play some cool game in which you could bound 6 feet, how much higher isn't it 1/6 gravity?
Yeah.
Something like that. Wouldn't that be cool? Human beings are always discovering cool new ways.
But essentially, you're kind of rejecting my premise, right? Now you're talking about...
I'm rejecting your premise.
Yeah, which is fine. It may be that there will just never be a way to simulate the feeling of reeling in a marlin, right? Or splitting wood.
Perhaps so, yeah.
In a Robert Frost poem or something like that. And so, yeah, that's certainly possible. Maybe there's no way to reproduce that kind of authenticity, and so there will always be, in a certain sense, scarcity, right? You can only put so many people on the moon at one time.
Or there would be new kinds of simulations to develop.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And they have to be produced. And
I want to go back to Rob wanted us to think optimistically. One possibility, I think it's realistic, is that the federal government, and I mean this in a soft sense, breaks apart. It downscales.
Mm-hmm.
And it reverts to the states much of the power of governing that the federal government currently has. What do you think about that? In my mind, you end up looking much like the United States did at the founding, when we basically governed at a state level.
Or even after the founding, when we basically governed at a state level.
Up till really further along in our history than most people would guess.
I think so. I mean, there's this great book that I think we're all aware of by Robert Higgs called Crisis in Leviathan. And, the thesis of it is that every time there's a crisis, real or imagined, the government will act, and there will be a whole bunch of programs and a whole lot of new spending. The government will accrue a whole, great deal of power. And then once the crisis is over, some of that power and money and those resources will be given back, but some will be retained, and there's a ratchet effect. And over time, the government just grows and grows and grows. And I think we've seen that throughout our history. But I think in the 20th century especially, we've seen the national government really gain supremacy in a very real and palpable way over the state governments. And if that can be reversed, I think there would be a lot of opportunity for people to vote with their feet. And as you have already pointed out, we see that. I mean, we see plenty of people. People who used to live next to us, they moved to South Carolina. The people who used to live across from them, they moved to South Carolina.
My neighbors are heading to South Carolina. Just sold their house.
There's something good going on in South Carolina. Or there's something a whole lot less bad going on in South Carolina.
At least once your kids are out of school, I guess. Probably.
I guess.
Did they move with school-age kids?
They didn't.
Okay.
They didn't.
Yeah.
They were retirees.
Do either of you actually see this as plausible? Because I don't. But I'd love to, but I don't. I mean, what could cause the federal government to relinquish that?
The fact that it runs up against the laws of mathematics.
Does it? Could it ever?
You reach a point where you run into Howie's scenario of runaway inflation because you've got to monetize, or you run into the scenario I alluded to earlier that you're going to have to just keep on increasing taxes on workers or cut Social Security benefits, or you throw up your hands and you say, we can't do any of this. None of it's politically palatable. Let the individual states deal with it.
Sure. In the same way that Congress has abandoned its war-granting powers, it could abandon, its powers in these ways. One thing that you've observed many times, I'm not sure many times on Words and Numbers, though I suspect as much, is that historically at least, no matter what the top marginal tax rate,
It's a wonderful use
the
of
national government is never really capable of bringing in more than, is it like 17, 18%?
Like 17, 18%, of GDP.
So, I mean, I don't know what causes that rule to hold.
Yeah, I don't know either.
But if that rule continues to hold, what then? I mean, does that make the situation better, or does it make the situation worse?
It makes their inability to pay off worse because they can't increase their revenue. They can't increase their revenue and they persist in increasing their spending. The debt grows and grows and grows with the consequences that we're speculating about.
Yeah.
Has anybody else heard of this 80-20 rule? It's this idea that 80-20 seems to be a ratio that applies in so many places. Like, Howie, okay, so can you give an illustration or
I'm not sure that I can. I think it's 80% of the...
On a group project, 80% of the work will get done by 20%.
And 80% of the people sick comes from 20% of the population, the elderly 20% or something.
Yeah, so anyway, before Rob mentioned it, it never occurred to me before that there's this 80-20 thing going on with federal revenue, it seems like, right? Like, no matter where they set individual tax rates, they seem to be stuck at 20% of GDP, right, that they can extract through taxes. And it's a fascinating question whether that is as much of a ceiling as it looks like when you look at Ant's graphs that he's shown before, right? So, like, is it plausible to suppose that like 20% is a ceiling on how much wealth the federal government can extract.
It certainly seems to be that case. Again, I have no idea why. I can only say that it has been.
Now, it's 20% of what exactly?
Of
Income?
GDP.
Of GDP, okay.
Yeah. This actually becomes a little bit scary because the politicians' knee-jerk reaction is to raise tax rates, but when you raise tax rates, GDP grows at a smaller rate. And so you're still getting your 20%, but it's now 20% of a smaller pie.
I'm coming back to something that it's just like, it's so fascinating. This interplay of the inflation and interest rates and the debt, because they have to roll over the debt.
Yeah.
And interest rates have been so low for so long, everyone's gotten accustomed to it.
What does rollover the debt mean in this?
It means
situation?
that suppose Rob holds a 10-year U.S. bond.
Oh, I get it.
5-year
So it's a
bond,
fixed, yeah.
and it's due. They must pay him off the $1,000 tomorrow. Well, they've got to borrow that $1,000 from you in order to pay him off because they don't have any extra cash. They've got to borrow everything they need to pay off what they have to pay off now. That's rolling it over.
You said 10 years. That's correct. But the last time I looked, the average remaining life of a U.S. Treasury bond was 4 to 5 years, which means that within 4 to 5 years, half of the debt has been rolled over.
Okay, I see. In the journal yesterday, the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the inflation, the measured inflation, is over 5%.
It's over 6%.
Over 6%.
Yeah.
And which might be a momentary thing, but if it's not, if this is a trend, then if that persists, doesn't it stand to reason that the interest rates the government is going to have to pay on what it borrows is going to have to be higher than 6%?
Yeah.
Because people aren't going to say, here, I'll lend you the money at 0 point whatever interest, and you can pay me back 5 years from now in money that's lost 6% of its value in each of the intervening 5 years. People aren't going to do that. They're just going to be an inflation premium on the interest rates. Oh, if inflation is at 6%, I'll lend you money at 7.5%. But there's so much debt to be rolled over. If it's all rolled over at 7.5%, then that happened to Greece, right? Isn't that what happened to Greece?
I think so. I mean,
suddenly interest rates shot up. Everything was fine until it wasn't the next day. So I wonder if that could happen in the United States.
well, I think about we're in the same age range, and I think about how in the 1970s we had runaway inflation, and how the government broke it, and the government broke it by artificially raising interest rates to break the back of inflation, and then once inflation came down, then the interest rates could come down. Is that not correct?
Well, that's not quite correct. You're talking about Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve. Remember that the Federal Reserve does not set interest rates. It influences the money supply. If there's some interest rates it sets, like
Doesn't it set the prime rate?
Well, no, the prime rate is a market-determined rate that I forget exactly how it's defined. There's the rate they pay on excess reserves. But generally speaking, when people talk about interest rates, they mean market-determined interest rates. But the Fed influences them very, very much. So what Volcker did was he didn't set a high interest rate. He stopped accommodating this. He stopped increasing the money supply so fast.
Yeah, he stopped printing money.
He stopped printing money so fast. And that has the consequence, given enough time, if there isn't excessive new money flowing into the economy, more money chasing less goods, then inflation rates come down.
I mean, essentially, if I understand correctly, he induced the 1981-82 recession.
He took an action which he knew would mean interest rates going up for a while, as they had to do in order to then come back down.
And I don't know if this is the right analogy, but it was almost like chemotherapy for the economy. Because essentially inflation, if I understand it correctly, is when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods.
Right.
And by, inducing this recession, you got rid of the too many dollars problem. Not right?
Yeah, I'd say the causality the other way. You get rid of the too many dollars, and that one of the effects is it induces
to bring about
a
recession. That's right. Because people suddenly have less money to spend, so they can't spend at the local store, and the local store lays off someone, and there's your recession.
But the economy comes back, and as it comes back, it's coming back with fewer dollar bills.
So it's coming back into sustainable adjustment.
Right.
So the headlines of 1983 and 1984 were all like amazing news because interest rates were coming down, unemployment was coming down, inflation was coming down, and suddenly, it was people. I don't think people realize how bad it was in the 1970s, and gas lines are a distant memory. Interest rates that newlyweds had to take, they were going to buy a house. I mean, they might have an 18% interest rate mortgage.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I had a savings account that paid higher than 16% interest.
Wow. I have a savings account that pays 0.16%.
But at the worst of the inflation, if I was getting 16% interest, I was losing 3% a year because interest rates went to 19%. And so they paid me my 16%, but in dollars, the 19% less purchasing power. I'd lost 3%.
We see the financial crisis that we're self-inducing right now. We're laying little eggs that are going to hatch in a few years. And I mean, when you think about how inflation has taken place in the real estate market and the prices that people are paying for certain houses, one of the things that allows them to pay the prices that they're paying is that they can get these really cheap mortgages. But, we've seen these bubbles before and,
Does that bother you as an economist? I mean, does that seem like something that should happen in a healthy economy?
No. It's too low.
Yeah, that's the question I'm asking.
And then the question I had is, so I looked it up on my phone, and currently 9% of our federal budget goes towards servicing the debt. And of course,
wow, it's that high.
Well, it's that high, but it's also that low because think about how inflated the budget has become. Right, the debt, servicing the debt is non-negotiable. If we were spending half as what we're spending, it would be 18%.
That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when I think we're finally going to not have a guest, and I'll just berate Anthony for the entire episode. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. You
Send
can
us
join
email.
Our Facebook group.
Words and Numbers.
Shut up. You're out of order. You're out of order.
At gmail.com. Send us email.
That's it. I'm not going to say anything else now.
I win.
Done.
Send us email, everyone. Words and Numbers Podcast at gmail.com.
What contest in hell did you win that this is your reward? Come on, man. We'll see you all next week. I'm going to maybe figure out something interesting by then. Ant, I'll catch you later. And for crying out loud, people, be nice to each other. I don't know why I have to keep asking, but I will ask forever. Catch you later, Ant.
See you next week, James.